So I put this slide together to support the fact that this resource is an excellent example of how years of research, all the way from basic research to applied science and long-term strategic planning, can be communicated to you via outreach and extension efforts. I honestly think that this is a role that the Almond Board of California is uniquely positioned to fulfill, taking growers funded ABC directed research, partnering with many funding agencies, as you can see there on the left, and presenting it to industry members, to all of you, in a complete yet simple manner. I think that used properly, these Natrium BMPs will equip our growers to maximize profit and productivity while minimizing at the same time the negative effects of applying too much or too little. And you may already know that I'm so happy to see this work completed, because I think I was quite involved with this from the beginning. This was part of my PhD work in this area with my former professor, Patrick Brown, who will be talking in a minute about this. So Natrium management has definitely major impacts on the productivity of almonds orchards, the profitability of growers statewide, and the effect of it on the environment. And with the implementation of the irrigated land regulatory program, every grower is required to implement a plan that allows for the efficient use of fertilizers and reduced nutrient leaching into the groundwater. This guide gives growers the insights and tools to plan wisely and ensure compliance with this regulatory program. Ultimately, the goal of Natrium management is to apply adequate but not excessive amounts of nutrient so that productivity is optimized and loss to the environment is minimized. So in this resource, we will talk about the 4 R's of plant nutrition. We will start with the right rate, and for the right rate, we will emphasize that it is vital that industry members recognize that managing nutrient in almonds is really a balancing act of supply and demand, and I'm sure Patrick will go into those details. We will refer to the right time as understanding 3 nutrient uptake dynamics. We have developed new infographics that illustrate in this new version much better than I would say ever before when the trees uptake the nutrient from the soil and when the trees remobilize that nutrient from its deciduous parts, such as the leaves, and reallocate that nutrient into perennial structures to get ready for the next season. Very interesting new knowledge in that area. In the case of the right place, we will also provide new infographics that illustrate the key goal around the right place, which at the end of the day is to keep nutrient where most of the active roots are located, in the first 18 inches. And for the right source, we recognize that there are multiple sources of nutrient available for almond trees, all the way from inorganic fertilizers to the nutrient in the water and the inputs through different soil health practices. I think in this new document, we'll review and talk about all of them. So that said, Patrick, as always, it is a pleasure to collaborate with you, and thanks in advance for what you will present next.
Good. Well, thanks, Sebastian, for that introduction. You didn't steal all of my talk quite. I'm going to fill in a lot of the details of what Sebastian spoke about and summarize. This is, 12 years worth of research, but I'll try and give a succinct summary speaking about the key points that growers need to think about. We will talk a little bit about the basics of nitrogen. So there'll be just a little bit of soil science, a little bit of plant physiology to help you understand these principles. Then get into where nitrogen is lost from the orchard system, the principles of how you go about the sound fertilization, the 4 R's that Sebastian mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit about monitoring to nutrient status and nitrogen efficiency at the end. I'm sure I haven't said thanks to everybody, and I won't get the chance to do so, but this was a huge collaborative effort, as Sebastian mentioned, and it's kind of very satisfying to bring this towards a really nice conclusion, which this Nitrogen Best Management Practices handbook illustrates. So let's start with the why. Of course, you all know trees need nitrogen, but almond is somewhat unique amongst the crops in that it has such a high demand for nitrogen, and that's primarily because those nuts that we produce are rich in protein, and protein is made of nitrogen. This is important, and you'll see this later on, that the demand for nitrogen by the almond tree is very strongly, predominantly driven by how many nuts are on the tree. And relating that potential yield to fertilization practices is critical. Of course, nitrogen is also necessary for the leaves, for the flowers, for the blooms, and for growth of the tree. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. We'll also talk about, and Sebastian mentioned this briefly, is that nitrogen in the Californian environment is a problem. And I'll just very briefly describe what's happened and why that's come to be so important in how we do our management, and then talk a little bit about how to optimize management. So why is nitrogen a problem? Well, this first statement up the top here illustrates what the nature of the problem is. In California, for all the nitrogen that is applied to agricultural crops, only between 30 and 50% of that nitrogen is recovered in the product that we eat, and the remainder goes into the environment. And that's illustrated here on the right-hand side is the total inputs. This is in gigagrams of nitrogen into the Californian environment, about 900. The total outputs in harvested product, that's only about a half of it. And then there's this leftover, there's the 300 to 450. So that's 30 through 50% of all applied nitrogen that ends up going into, or potential to go into, the groundwater of California. And of course, that came to a head with recognition that the water sources in much of California had been contaminated, and there was lots of news articles regarding this, and the proposal from the water boards that nitrogen in Californian agriculture will have to be regulated. And that's where we are right now. The Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program prescribes how much nitrogen a grower can apply, and growers have an obligation to attempt to eliminate those losses and maximize their efficiency. So I'm going to talk about how that's achieved, and start with a little bit of the basics, the background of nitrogen in the environment. And I like this diagram here. There's also another diagram like this in the new nitrogen management booklet. And fundamentally, what you're trying to do in managing any nitrogen or any nutrient in a crop is have the supply of that nutrient meet the demand of the tree. And that's a pretty simple equation, but of course, there's some complexity to that. On the supply side, you do have to consider not only the nitrogen that you apply as a fertilizer, but also, of course, the nitrogen that's coming in irrigation water, and in much of California, that can be quite substantial. Or if you're using residues or organic matter or cover crops, the nitrogen that's coming in there. On the demand side of the equation, it is understanding how much is going into the harvested product, how much is going into the growth of the tree, and how much is being lost from the system. And we'll go through each of those in a moment. We'll introduce you to the terms here on the left. How much nitrogen is needed, that is to determine the rate, when is it needed, the timing, and how should it be applied, the placement, the source, and the methods. And all of this is aimed at preventing losses while simultaneously maximizing productivity. So I'm going to go below ground a little bit and talk a little bit about nitrogen itself, just to help you understand where and why the challenge with nitrogen occurs. Now, because almonds have such a large demand for nitrogen, most of the supply, almost all of the supply, will come from fertilizers or amendments that we add, in addition to the nitrogen that may be in the water. And predominantly, we provide nitrogen either as the ammonium ion with the plus, or nitrate with the negative, or a mixture. UAN32 is a mixture of the two. Let's talk a little bit about nitrate. Nitrate itself never really associates with the soil organic matter or the soil minerals. It remains in the solution, the water within the soil, making it readily available to the plant, but also making it readily available to move beyond the root zone with any water that moves through that system. So excess irrigation, rainfall in the springtime, etc., all has the potential to move nitrate through that system. And that's because that nitrate doesn't associate with the organic matter or the minerals. Ammonium, because it's got this positive charge, will associate with the organic matter and the minerals in the soil until it's converted by bacteria in the soil into nitrate, in which case it behaves exactly the same as the nitrate that you may have applied and is hence subject to loss. Now, to give you an illustration, I'm going to go back to some very old literature to illustrate just how easily and quickly nitrate moves through the profile. This experiment goes all the way back to Davis in the 50s, Professor Broadbent. And what he's done here is apply 3 different types of fertilizer, so ammonium sulfate or urea or calcium nitrate, to the soil surface of either a salinas clay, a yolo loam, or a Hanford sandy loam. So the nitrogen was applied to the soil surface, the surface was saturated with water, and the experiment was run for 90 minutes. And if we look just at this Sanford loam, after 90 minutes, you can see that ammonium is still right at the surface of the soil. Urea has moved 6 inches deep. The calcium nitrate has moved 7 to 9 inches deep. Now remember, this is just one application of irrigation water and a 90-minute incubation time. So that really illustrates to you just how quickly nitrogen can move through the water. And you should have that in your mind when you're thinking about fertigation and irrigation. What's going to happen to the nitrogen on that soil surface as you push water through the profile. Now, of course, I mentioned that ammonium is, and I show it here, is much less likely to move through the profile. The next question, of course, is, well, how quickly does ammonium turn into nitrate in the soil? And the answer to that question is very quickly. So if you start here at time 0 in this graph, and you put ammonium onto this soil surface, and then you go across 2 or 3 weeks, and you see how rapidly that ammonium turns into nitrate. And in the temperatures that you would expect in a San Joaquin, South Sacramento soil, that conversion is almost 100% complete within 2 weeks and 50% within 1 week. So even though we may choose to apply a urea ammonium, or an ammonium-based fertilizer to help protect from the nitrogen movement through that soil, bear in mind that it's going to convert into nitrate extremely rapidly. And at that point, it just simply moves wherever the water moves. And now I'm going to show you a little bit of plant science here. I'll explain what's going on just to make this clear. On this axis here on the left, this is an illustration of how rapidly the plant is taking up nitrogen. On the bottom here is different nitrogen application rates. Now, as you might imagine, as you go from no nitrogen to some nitrogen, the plant takes up the nitrogen. As nitrogen concentrations increase a bit, the plant takes up nitrogen quicker, but it does reach a point where it no longer takes any nitrogen, no longer increases the uptake of nitrogen, and this curve goes flat here. All right. When we typically do a fertigation event, that is injecting nitrogen, the concentration will be way out here on the right-hand side. So what you can see from this is most of the time after we've fertilized the soil, there is way more nitrogen in the soil than the plant can use. And I think of that a little bit like this lion here sitting eating his zebra. There's only so much zebra this lion can eat. And once he's full, eating will stop. And so the same is true for nitrogen and for trees. And this zebra will be lost if left uneaten. The hyenas will take it, or it'll turn bad. And likewise, the nitrogen in the soil will be lost if it is not eaten. And so this period, this time between when we apply nitrogen and when the plant catches up is the most dangerous time for the loss of nitrogen in the environment. There's a couple of other slides I want to show to illustrate this really important principle that trees do not take up more nitrogen than they need. It is the hunger of the tree that determines the uptake by the tree. Primarily in our trees, in almonds, the hunger of the tree is determined by what is the yield of the tree, what is the size of the tree. So this is an experiment that Sebastian was involved in, 4 different rates of nitrogen, and what we're showing you here is the leaf nitrogen value. And as you all know, the nitrogen concentration in the leaf, the percent nitrogen, decreases with time. We're going to focus only on this 129 day, so this is mid-July time frame. And we're looking at leaf nitrogen here. So if you look at this red line, these trees are hungry. They don't have enough nitrogen. Leaf tissue value about 2. You add another 75 pounds, you're going to the 200 pound rate, and you can see the tree responds rapidly, that leaf tissue nitrogen goes up. You add another 75 pound to bring those trees to fully satisfied, and again, leaf nitrogen goes up. But if you add another 75 pounds in excess of what the trees actually need, nothing happens. The trees are not taking that nitrogen from the soil. And it's this event, this over-fertilization while the trees are not hungry, that is the chance and the opportunity for nitrogen to be lost from the system. I've got one more slide to illustrate that same principle. This is an old data set from the mid-70s. 5 different nitrogen fertilization rates here, from 0 to the very high 450. Let's just look at yield, which is pretty good for a 1970s orchard here, going from 2,000 to 3,600 pounds. But notice you don't get an increment in yield when you've gone above about 150 pounds in this case. And in fact, this last 175 pounds of applied nitrogen was not used at all. Now, there's a term you will see when you're doing the irrigated lands regulatory program, the nitrogen reporting is your nitrogen use efficiency, or your applied over removed ratio. If you do that calculation here, when we're just feeding those trees what they need, we can easily get 80% efficiency with nitrogen use. Once we feed those trees more than they need, this efficiency of nitrogen goes down to 45%. So that's the challenge, that's the problem that we have to deal with and think about in managing nitrogen. So just to summarize, why does nitrate leach? Why does this nitrogen get into the groundwater and contaminate that drinking source? It's because in California, it really doesn't matter what source of nitrogen you apply, they will become nitrate very quickly. Nitrate has a negative charge, it doesn't get held by the soil, it moves through the water very quickly. If we had more organic matter in our soils, we could slow this down, but we're typically very low organic matter soils. And then it's management that does it. Applying too much, applying at the wrong time, moving the nitrogen below the water, below the rooting depth. Those are the sources of the loss. So that's where the problems come from. So next is to think about what can we do as growers to manage this? How do we understand this system? How do we optimize it so that trees are robust and healthy, but they're not sitting in soils that have more nitrogen than they can take up? So we'll look at in detail at this rate and this timing and this placement, and then I'll come back to this figure a couple more times to illustrate some other issues related to this diagram. So let's start with the 4 R's. This was a program initiated by the International Plant Nutrition Institute, and it's been widely implemented across the US. And first, it starts with thinking about the right rate, asking the question if the nitrogen demand of a tree is driven by its growth and driven by its number of nuts, its yield, then we need to be able to estimate what that is and use that to make our decisions. We equally need to consider what other sources of nitrogen might exist in the environment. Nitrogen left over from the previous year, nitrogen in irrigation water. We also need to clearly understand what the right timing of uptake is. No point having all the nitrogen in the soil at the beginning of the year. You need to have it in the soil during the year when root uptake is occurring, when the tree is demanding it. We need to think about the right placement. Where do you put that nitrogen in the field so that it remains active, it remains available for the active roots. How do you manage your irrigation systems to make sure that occurs? And I'll talk a little bit about how do you deal with orchards that are variable and cultivars that have different demands. And then right source, what is the right formulation to use to keep the nitrogen active and available for plants growing actively? So right rate, you know, if I was working in a celery plant or a lettuce or a strawberry, this is a very easy experiment to do. In almonds, this is not an easy experiment to do. The only real way to do it is to harvest the entire tree, all the leaves, all the nuts, excavate it so you measure all the nitrogen, all the different parts of the tree, and do that at multiple times over the year. We did do that, and it was a tremendous contribution from the wonderful orchards to allow us to take all these trees out. And it allows us to generate this curve, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. This is the total nitrogen in all of the biomass of all of the trees in this 12-year-old very high producing orchard. What we did was choose 200 trees and apply different amounts of nitrogen to them. We then excavated 6 of those trees at each of 3 dates across 2.5 years. We then took subsamples from all of the trees at multiple times during the year and used all of this to create this graph which I show here. Now I'm going to show you a simplified version of this. This one here shows the nitrogen in all the different parts of the tree. I'm going to simplify that just into the perennial parts and the annual parts, the fruits and the leaves. So just to illustrate what's going on here, this is the total nitrogen that exists in trees at this first date in January 26th, and then at subsequent dates during the year to the end of the year. We're looking at the change in the total nitrogen content across this time. So we start here in January, and the total nitrogen content of this entire orchard, all parts of it, was 460 pounds. You then enter the period where you get flowering and bloom and early leaf out, which is right where we are now in most of California. And if you look at the total nitrogen content, one thing you would see here is that there is no increase in nitrogen in these trees, in any part of these trees, over this first period until you get to about 70% leaf out. What that means is the nitrogen that's necessary for these flowers, these early leaves, these early nuts, is coming from storage. It's not coming from uptake from the soil. It's only once you enter that 50 to 70% leaf out and those nuts start to develop that the soil becomes the source of nitrogen for the almond tree. This is when uptake is occurring. So if you think back to that illustration I made with the lion and the zebra, there's no point having abundant nitrogen in the soil at this time, excuse me, because the trees are not feeding from the soil. This, of course, is also the time, if you're in wetter portions of California, excuse me, where rainfall can occur and losses can occur. You get towards the end of the year here, and in this particular crop, and this was a large crop of 3,800 pounds of kernel, a total of 260 pounds of new nitrogen uptake occurred during that year, during this period here. Excuse me one second. Once you've harvested the crop and the leaves start to senesce, then the tree refills the nitrogen into that trunk in roughly about this 35-pound amount. So 30 pounds early in the year is used to supply the trees. 35 pounds is stored later to supply the subsequent year. And in this case, 260 pounds was taken up. We'll see these numbers later on in the next slide, because this is the origin of the nitrogen recommendations that we've provided for you for almond. So this is a table that exists in the new management practice book that Sebastian was speaking about. And what we have here are typical nitrogen application rates and the guidelines for how to estimate those demands for trees as they go from young planted to peak productivity to mature trees. Firstly, there is an allocation to grow the tree itself. And for some of you who've followed this work for a while, this is new, where we've added back into this equation nitrogen necessary to grow the tree. And as you imagine, when the tree is very young, the demand is low. When it reaches the period of peak growth, years 2 through 5 or 6, the nitrogen demand is high. And once it's fully mature and closed canopy, nitrogen demand to grow the tree becomes less. As I mentioned previously, yield, the number of nuts on those trees, is the most important component of determining your nitrogen demand. And you can calculate that by your estimated yield multiplied by this number. And then you add this one together, the tree demand, the fruit demand, to get your representative or your typical fertilization demands. Now, of course, each of you growing different cultivars at different densities in different environments, these numbers may change slightly. A very, very vigorous young orchard, maybe in Independence, heavily fertilized, may have yield and significant yield early in its life, whereas others in less favorable conditions will be growing less quickly. So while this is a guideline and these are typical values, you will always have to adjust it for your own circumstance. Okay, so that's the supply part of the equation. That's the demand part of the equation, how much nitrogen is needed during the year. To convert this demand into a supply, you simply need to take away from that equation any of the sources of nitrogen that might be in the environment. Nitrogen in irrigation water, nitrogen in cover crops, nitrogen remaining in the soil. And the difference between those two becomes your fertilization rate. There is a guideline in the booklet for how to equate or how to calculate nitrogen provision from irrigation water. And you should really be thinking of any nitrogen that exists in irrigation water as free fertilizer. This is just dissolved nitrate. So in every regard, it is exactly the same as fertilizer nitrogen. And depending on the concentration of nitrogen in that water and the amount of water you applied, you can calculate the offset of nitrogen that's coming in from the irrigation water. And since we use irrigation water exactly the same time as the trees are using nitrogen, this is actually a wonderful free source of nitrogen. So this is the diagram that Sebastian spoke about that puts together these different pieces of the puzzle that I just spoke about. Early in the year, the tree is remobilizing nitrogen from the trunk to provide the flowers and the early leaflets. Once that has been depleted, the tree rapidly takes up nitrogen to fill the nuts, complete photosynthesis, and get you a harvested product. Once those nuts are harvested, the demand drops dramatically since the predominant demand has already been completed. The trees have grown and the nuts have grown. Then the tree starts to store nitrogen back into its perennial tissues for use in subsequent years. There's a summary table, I won't go into this, that you can look at that summarizes this information as well. Now, one of the discussions I often get with growers, even though I've illustrated here that timing your nitrogen application is critically important, that you don't want to put too much nitrogen on the ground when the trees are not hungry, many growers will, of course, be familiar with the widely accepted and long-held belief that you've got to withdraw nitrogen from the trees early before harvest, often around May, early June, to prevent hull rot. And I want to address that because that practice actually compromises the efficiency of nitrogen use. And I'll explain that in a second. First, it is a fact. If you apply trees, if you give trees too much nitrogen, hull rot can increase. So here we have an experiment going from leaf tissues of 2% to 2.4 to 2.8, measuring hull rot percentage going from 15% to 30%. So yes, absolutely, nitrogen increases hull rot. And it does so because it makes a hull that is more attractive to the fungus. It does so because the tree canopy becomes more humid with the lush growth of vegetation. And it does so because it changes fruit ripening, keeping the fruit on the tree for longer. So it is true that nitrogen excess will cause hull rot. But does that mean that you should stop fertilizing in May or June? And the answer to that is no, it does not mean that. And I'm going to illustrate that here. So here again, this is our same dates that I showed you previously, the different development stages of the fruit and the tree, and the nitrogen demand. So a perfect fertilization schedule would be delivering nitrogen, feeding this animal exactly in proportion to its demand. So here's an illustration with these blue dots of multiple fertilization rates, timings to meet the demand of the plant. Now, what happens if you adopt the approach of withdrawing nitrogen in late May, early June? And that's illustrated here with this common fertilization strategy, these red dots. If you're going to withdraw the nitrogen in the middle of the year in June and July, what that inherently means is you must put that nitrogen on earlier. And so you have here fertilization rates at each of these 4 timings here that are well in excess of the demand of the tree. And there's 2 things that can happen. The first is, of course, this nitrogen that is sitting in the soil waiting for the trees to catch up can be lost to the environment. If you happen to get a hot spell, you're putting on 4 inches or 6 inches of water in the month of June, July, in May and June, you will wash that nitrogen out of the soil. And the other thing that happens is that this excess nitrogen will cause leaves to become higher nitrogen level, excuse me, and a little bit more vigor to occur in the tree. Both of those things are not favorable. The other thing that is important to recognize is if you have withdrawn all your nitrogen and stopped fertilizing in May, then you run the risk of being limited in your nitrogen during a very critical phase of tree development, and that is the initiation of the buds and the flowers for the subsequent year that occur during this time frame here. I liken this to the human analogy. You know, if we overfeed when young, we have the tendency to be overfed when mature, and that is what causes susceptibility to disease. So it's this excess uptake of nitrogen early in the year that causes or can lead to increased susceptibility to hull rot, as well as the losses. So the ideal solution is indeed to go to a feeding program that is lean and mean. That is, it's providing exactly what is needed when it is needed. And the old practices of withdrawing all your nitrogen really was only a consequence of overfeeding early. And if you didn't overfeed early, you would not need to withdraw late. And a consistent fertilization throughout the entire year is also very, very useful. There's one other thing I wish to illustrate, of course, is if you've gone about putting all your nitrogen on early, and for some reason you calculate, oh, I didn't need as much nitrogen as I initially chose, you have no opportunity to correct that error. If you'd put it on carefully and cautiously through the entire year, you still have a room here to back off on the nitrogen if you need to. So that's the ideal fertilization approach. A couple of weeks back, I gave a talk about early harvest and off-ground harvest, and I put this in here because this is relevant to that discussion as well. So these are some experiments that Sebastian and his wife Alana did during her master's, looking at hull rot. We have 2 nitrogen supply levels here, 125, so this is low, and 350, this is excessive. And we're looking at the development of hull rot over time. So hull rot, of course, there's none until you get the open nuts appearing. Then it can increase dramatically, much higher when the nitrogen was high, much lower when the nitrogen was low. But what's important here, and why I wanted to illustrate that, is the earlier you harvest, the less hull rot you will have. So this data point here, 2 weeks prior to traditional harvest ripening, normally we wouldn't start shaking until we're in this stage E up the top here, but shaking can be done perfectly well at stage C and D. If you shake at that time, you don't have hull rot. All right, so this is just a summary of that section. Oops, let me go back up. Certainly, excess nitrogen can cause hull rot. There is no question about that. However, that does not mean you overload early in the season and deplete late in the season. That is not a satisfactory solution to this problem. The right way to do it is to manage your nitrogen applications as close as possible to the demand and the timing of those trees. Okay, this is another figure, a nice figure that's been put in this new document, illustrating that integration, illustrate the thinking about you've really got to know what your demand is, how old are your trees, what yield potential they have. That sets the starting point. You really need to know what all the sources of nitrogen in your environment are, whether you've got organic matter out there, irrigation water that's got nitrogen in it, cover crops, or of course fertilizers. And you need to pay attention to the timing of when applications occur to match when the tree is hungry. The tree is hungry during leaf out and fruit development, these two pieces of the curve up here. Let's talk about place. What can you do to keep nitrogen in the soil and avoid any opportunity for it to escape out the bottom? This is an analysis of the right place. So right place involves ensuring your delivery to where the active roots are. So that initiates a question immediately. Where are the active roots in an almond orchard? Since the nitrogen is moving with water, how you manage your water is incredibly important on how nitrogen moves through the profile. Orchards are variable, and if you apply a single rate to satisfy okay, so let's talk about the right place. How do you make sure you're delivering to the active roots? How do you integrate it with irrigation and fertilization? What do you do to consider the variability that exists in the orchard? All right, so we've done a lot of work over the years to find out where roots are active within the profile of the orchard. And we do that using this tube that gets inserted in the ground that lets us visualize the roots themselves. When you do that, and in the various places that we've done this analysis, and this has been repeated by other scientists as well, the vast majority of roots, the fine, active, foraging roots, are in that top 18 inches of the soil. And this is understandable because this is where the irrigation is managed for most orchards. So that's where the roots are. Our goal then, of course, is to therefore keep the nitrogen in this 18-inch zone. And I'm going to show you a few examples of how that occurs and what we can do to make sure that is managed. The primary driver of how nitrogen moves through the soil is water. Since nitrogen, nitrate in particular, moves in the water stream, how we manage that water is all determinant. So I'm going to show an example here of a fertigation strategy that is not what you should do. What this graph illustrates is these colors represent the concentration of nitrate in the soil. In this particular scenario, what we did was we injected 25 pounds of nitrogen in a 1.5 inch 24-hour irrigation event, but we put that nitrogen on the soil in the first 3 to 6 hours, followed it with 21 hours of water, and then looked 21 days later to see where the nitrogen was. And not surprisingly, we've pushed all that nitrate to the bottom of the soil profile. And this is 21 days after application, and you can see the concentrations are still really quite high here. This is an example of doing it wrong. A large application applied at the beginning of an irrigation set, pushing it through the profile where it is under potential to be lost. You can model how to do this in many different ways, and we've done that. This is our injection of the nitrogen into that fertigation event at 0 to 3, 3 to 6, 9 to 12. The key point here is once you get into that middle of that injection, that irrigation set, that is, you're irrigating at hour 12 through to fertigating through hour 21, no longer do you see this large concentration of nitrate escaping out of the bottom. So this is the single most important thing you can do to manage your nitrogen and your irrigation collectively. Bear in mind, this works much better if you fertigate in every single irrigation rather than fertigating only 3 or 4 times in a year. There is a really important relationship between distribution uniformity and nitrogen management. Now, we all think of distribution uniformity as a problem only for our irrigation systems, but I want to illustrate here why it's also important for our fertigation systems. So 2 fields illustrated here on the left, one with a distribution uniformity of 90%, one on the right with a distribution uniformity of 70%. You're attempting to apply 25 millimeters of water in a relatively good distributed uniform orchard. You might range from 22 to 28 delivered millimeters of water, 1 inch of water. In a very non-uniform with poor distribution uniformity, you will be delivering 36 millimeters at one portion of the field and half as much at another portion of the field. If you're using your irrigation system to deliver your fertilization and you put on 250 pounds with distribution uniformities like this, you can see in the worst case with poor uniformity, you're only putting 180 pounds of nitrogen on a portion of the orchard. That portion is hungry, and you're way overdoing it in another portion of the orchard. So distribution uniformity, which you've historically thought of as only an irrigation issue, is a fertilization issue as well. There's also a challenge in young orchards. Frequently we have an irrigation system established for the mature orchard, but when the trees are young, most of the roots of those trees are not exploring the applied water. So on the right here, if this is your tree and this is your drip emitter that is delivering water and nitrogen, clearly most of that nitrogen, most of that water is not being applied to the tree. So you've got to pay attention to that in young orchards. In young orchards also, we're seeing increasingly a use of the whole orchard recycling system where the entire mature old orchard is ground up and reincorporated in the soil. This is becoming more prevalent. It's good practice for soil organic matter. It's good practice for recycling nitrogen. And it's good practice to minimize burning and pollution caused by fires and agricultural burning. To illustrate what a ground-up orchard contributes to the orchard, there's about 400 pounds of nitrogen that you have applied in that previous orchard's lifetime that is still sitting in the trunks, and significant amounts of potassium and calcium, and of course significant amounts of carbon as well. All of these nutrients, though, are not available. And in the first couple of years, not only is this nitrogen not available, but this carbon in the soil will grab hold of the nitrogen and starve the trees. As a consequence, in the whole orchard recycling scenarios, you often need to put a little bit more nitrogen down early to prevent that soil from capturing the nitrogen due to all the rich carbon that's in there. And that was illustrated in the table that I showed you previously, and I'll show you in the next figure. These asterisks we have up here that illustrates the amount of nitrogen required for young trees pre-yield. This will vary depending on how much orchard recycling has occurred. Okay. I've spoken many times in this that the primary determinant of demand of nitrogen by trees is the yield potential. And so here's an illustration of South San Joaquin large orchards with different amounts of yield history and yield potential, mostly driven by their age. And you can see we have orchards here that can run 5,000 pounds and orchards that can run 1,500 pounds. Simplest, most realistic first decision every grower should be making is to fertilize every single field on the basis of its true yield potential. That's the first and most obvious, the easiest decision to make. It must be standard practice in all of Californian agriculture. But it's more complicated than that. This is an aerial image of a 160-acre block of almonds. And what we're looking at is the vegetative index, how green, how lush, how big those trees are. And you can see you've got portions of the field on the right-hand side here that are much more vigorous than most of the trees on the left-hand side of this field. Here you have a problem. This entire 160-acre plot is fertigated with a single irrigation fertigation system. And you can see here immediately, if yield and growth potential is how you determine what your fertilization rate will be, now you have a difficult decision to make. Could you mute that microphone if you don't mind? So that's the first challenge. And as you're all aware, of course, there is another challenge. We have multiple cultivars, unless we're with the self-fertile cultivars. This is, in this case, alternate rows of Monterey and Nonpareil. And you can see one of the cultivars, I think in this case it's the Monterey, is much more vigorous than the Nonpareil is. You have therefore another question. If tree demand is what drives nitrogen fertilization rate, and you have this variability in the field, how do you make a decision that suits everyone? In established orchards, this is difficult because you've got your irrigation fertigation systems in place. I would argue in new orchards, it's not difficult. This is an example of an independent lines being run for each of the 3 cultivars. That allows you to irrigate independently for differential harvest periods. That allows you to fertigate independently for differential yields and demands. And I think this is an essential move that every new orchard should automatically have in place. Okay. Now, I do much more plant nutrition than simply nitrogen, and so I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the other elements, and I'll just do that very briefly. This is that same orchard that I showed you with very different levels of yield and productivity. Most of this left-hand side of the orchard is underperforming the right-hand side of the orchard. It turns out that is a zinc deficiency in this particular case. And so one thing to think about in optimizing the use of nitrogen, you have to optimize everything else. If you optimize this, correct the zinc deficiency in this portion of the orchard, bringing it back to the performance of the right-hand side of this orchard, now it is easier to manage your nitrogen because you have an orchard that is much more uniform, and a single decision on fertilization rates becomes more appropriate for the orchard as a whole. We saw that in this particular field. This is that large experiment we did down at Wonderful. Again, the 4 different rates of nitrogen generating different tissue nitrogen values. You can see the tissue nitrogen value going up as the fertilization goes up, as would be expected. This is the yield curve at the top here. And I put this in to illustrate this point. Every one of these trees within this orange circle has all the nitrogen they could ever need. And yet they are yielding as much as 2,000 pounds less than these trees at the top. What is happening is there's something else limiting these trees. And so you've always got to think about that. If my trees are not responding to nitrogen, if I have variability in the field that is making it difficult to make a nitrogen decision, the solution is often solve the other problems. Fix the drainage, fix the irrigation, fix the other micronutrients, or manipulate the soil characteristics if you can. And this is just classic plant nutrition. You know, the yield you can get, the amount of water you can hold in this bucket will always be determined by the single element or nutrient or condition that is most limiting. So there's always that interaction to pay attention to. Okay. I want to move now a little bit on to some of the practicalities, and in particular start here with a discussion of leaf and soil sampling. Should you do it, and should you use it to adjust your fertilizer rates? And the short answer is yes. Leaf sampling, soil sampling is still very, very valuable. In the case of that prior slide that I showed you, identification of the zinc deficiency became critical for productivity and efficiency of nitrogen management. For nitrogen, leaf and tissue sampling is not your first step in the process. Your first step in the process is always to do that demand-supply calculation. How much do these trees need? How much are they expected to need? What are the sources of nitrogen in the environment? That's where you make your nitrogen decision. You then use leaf and soil sample to verify that you're doing things approximately right. Leaf and soil samples remain incredibly important for almost all the other nutrients, however. It's one of the challenges of soil sampling and leaf sampling is, however, that it's very difficult to get a representative sample. And we just went through the elections recently, and many of us were watching the polls and surprised that sometimes the polls give you good numbers of who's going to be elected, and sometimes the polls give you terrible numbers of who's going to be selected. That all depends on whether they took a representative sample. And if they didn't get a representative sample, they cannot make a representative conclusion. And it's exactly the same principle in your orchards. If you were to park your donkey here and collect leaf samples by running into the orchard and grabbing leaves, if you happen to park here, you'd get a nitrogen value of 2%. If you happen to park down on the southern side of this orchard, you'd get a nitrogen value of 3%. The actual value, the average value for that orchard was 2.4. So sampling properly is everything. Sampling poorly is a complete waste of time. You've just wasted your $50 for that tissue analysis and that $100 it cost you to send that guy out in the field to collect that sample. So sampling must be done correctly. We've done a lot of work on this. Sebastian did this in his PhD of how to do it correctly. It's a lot more work than the traditional jump out of the pickup and grab 30 leaves and stick them in a bag and jump back in. If it's not done properly, it's not worth doing. In the new document, there's an explanation for how to do it, both for early season samples, which are very valuable to help you know whether you're on target, or the more traditional later season samples to help you understand what the circumstance will be for the subsequent year. So do it right, or don't waste your time doing it, to be quite honest. There's one more page in here in this document which summarizes pretty much all that I've been talking about. All of the issues of the right rate, the right time, the right place. And you can look at that. This has been mailed to everybody, I believe. It's certainly available for everybody. And it does go through the right rate, which is talking about calculating tree demand. Now, sometimes I get asked, well, how the heck do I know what the yield of this 8-year-old nonpareil is going to be in this coming year? Reality is, you're pretty good at doing this. Most growers are pretty good at doing this. You know what's capable of trees in that sort of environment. You know what's happened in prior years. You have a sense of what the environment was last year and what the flowering conditions were this year. An observant grower can easily guess within 500 pounds. We have a couple of projects going on in my lab and other labs at UC Davis to help you get to the next level of accuracy in this, using some remote sensing and some horticultural practices, horticultural principles. So that'll be coming in future years, where we will be able to help you automatically estimate the yield potential of each of your cultivars in each of your orchards. I've talked a lot about right timing. This is all about feeding the trees when they're hungry. Right placement, which is all about making sure that nitrogen stays in the active root zones. First and foremost, that can be achieved by frequent small applications as opposed to infrequent large applications, but certainly managing your irrigation system for distribution uniformity, managing the timing of the irrigation event, putting that nitrogen in towards the end of the irrigation cycle is critical. Also, right place is to start to think about that variability in the field, differences between cultivars, differences between zones in the field, and also right source. We have not had much chance to talk about that, but that's another important characteristic. So there's a lot of information that I've provided here, and it may seem a little bit daunting. You do have that document that Sebastian mentioned, that the Almond Board's Nitrogen Best Management Practices document. Really excellent. There's a short version and a long version. You can also access all of this information through the Almond Board's website, particularly through the CASP program. And the CASP program also offers a detailed nitrogen management software and decision support tool where you can enter information from your orchards and the program will help you make those decisions. I'm going to show you that in just a second. CDFA Fertilizer Resource Program has lots of good documents here. Crop Manage, which is run through UC, also has an excellent program that will help you make these decisions. And this integrates almonds and pistachios and walnuts now. Started with vegetable crops, but now it's much more wide. So I'm going to show you a little bit about the CASP program and how it works. I know we only have a few more minutes, so firstly, why should you bother with this? You should bother with this because it helps you make these decisions. I've gone through a number of complex topics and approaches and thoughts today. This is all integrated here. This uses the schedules that my lab and others have developed for the nitrogen budgeting. It automatically updates as you enter your own applications and your own conditions and your own yield estimates. It gives you a proactive and a forward-looking estimate of what's going to be required. It creates a permanent record. This document is it will generate the forms that are required by the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program as well. So just to step you through this program, if you've not gone onto it, I urge that you do. The website will first ask you to select here on your nitrogen calculator. You then have the option of entering a variety of any number of different blocks that you may have. There is the capability of running this program on every individual block that you have. Of course, if you have multiple blocks that are identically planted, then you can do this with just a single block analysis. You enter the information for that block to create a nitrogen budget. It provides the background information that I've just stepped through of when nitrogen demand occurs and when fertilization should occur. It then creates the schedule of fertilization. This is based on 4 individual applications. This can be increased to more than 4 applications if you wish to do that. It allows you to enter information on your yield, your irrigation nitrogen content, if you've used any manures, compost, cover crops, and then your fertilization application rates. And it is sensitive to the product you use, so you can enter the product name and the quantity, and it will calculate the nitrogen amount that will be required. And as I said, ultimately, it'll generate this summarization here, and also will generate a summarization that has been designed to meet the requirements of your local water coalition, the nitrogen reporting requirements. It also gives you a historical archive of what you've done, and that becomes really important for record keeping. I should also mention that you can put your leaf tissue analyses in here, and it will interpret those leaf tissue analyses for you and adjust your nitrogen fertilization recommendations accordingly. So last slide, just to summarize how you think about all of this together. You've got to think about this system, the supply, the demand, and the loss part of the equation. What are you putting into the system? What is the demand of the tree? What is the potential for loss? And what is the timing of demand? Those pieces of information, along with all the work that we've done in my lab over the years to generate these curves of demand and the relationship between yield and demand, is what you need to do to make the decisions. And then you need to implement it accurately and implement it properly. And the number one driver of effective implementation, once you've got the right rate and the right timing, is the placement of that fertilizer in the rooting zone. Remember, those trees have their active roots only in that top 18 inches. Varies a little bit depending on your irrigation and your soils, but that's classically where they are. And that's where the nitrogen must be maintained and must be held. You've got to think about variability in the field. At the very least, you've got to think about different yield potentials between the 2 cultivars, because it's easy to get 1,000 pounds plus or minus difference between your non-Perel and your cultivar in your orchards. The self-fertile single-planted cultivars make this a little bit easier. And finally, there is always a consideration of the source of nitrogen that you're using. It is true that that ammonium turns very rapidly into nitrate. But if you're doing a spoon feeding program or you're fertilizing with every irrigation, then the nitrogen applied as ammonium will only be in the environment for a week or a little bit more than a week. So ammonium can have a role here, as can soil organic matter and as can maintaining soil quality and soil health. And with that, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brown. I'm just going to quickly go over on how to locate this guide before we continue to the question Q&A session. So you can locate this guide on almonds.com, like Dr. Brown said, under Almond Orchard Management. And there's two sources, the full guide or the quick guide that you can download as PDFs. And if you also would like a hard copy of this, then please email us at industry@almondboard.com and we'll mail you a hard copy. So with that, we'll go to the live Q&A. We're going to start with Todd Olson. You had your hand raised, and then I'm going to pop up the questions in the chat. For everyone else, feel free to type your questions in the chat function or just raise your hand and we'll call on you. So Todd, do you want to start us off with your question first, please? And you are muted, so if you want to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, first time on this program and I was touching buttons to see what they were. I do not have a question.
No
Okay.
problem.
I can answer.
Thank you.
We'll start with Russ in the chat. If they stop taking up nitrogen, how can you burn trees with nitrogen?
Right. So nitrogen burn is a consequence of the salt level or the ionic level of the particular applied product. So a very high concentration, particularly of ammonium, causes the burn not because of excess nitrogen, but because of excess ionic stress and ammonium toxicity itself. So that's the main issue that's going on there. It's not a supersaturation with nitrogen and a nitrogen toxicity directly.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Alec. If organic matter stays in the soil profile and does not leach, why is it reported in the INMP? Seems like growers are penalized for applying organic matter. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So any organic matter that you apply will have some nitrogen in it, and the amount of nitrogen will vary. That nitrogen will release over time. And so when they think, I wasn't quite sure whether you were talking about organic additions or organic matter, but so applied organic material has nitrogen in it. It will release nitrogen, therefore it is part of your equation. So that's part of the reason it is considered. Soil organic matter is not directly considered in the INMP, though if you know that organic matter is mineralizing at 50 pounds a year, there would be an expectation that you include that 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year in your equations. So they don't really penalize organic matter. They just expect you to account for the release of nitrogen from that organic matter.
All right, thank you. Doug, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, along the same lines as the last compost question.
Yep.
How long does it take to break down and get into the leaf so that we can sample it? Like you say,
Yeah.
you're supposed to put in 20% of your nitrogen budget at when the leaf out. If you're going to do organic or other practices to limit putting in nitrogen, how do you time this?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Now, the document that was shown, the best management practices, has an extensive description of the rate at which nitrogen is mobilized or made available in different organic matters. So there are numbers there for whether you've got a corral manure or a chicken manure or a turkey manure or a rice bran organic matter, which will tell you how quickly that stuff will release its nitrogen. Also on the CASP worksheet, you can enter the type of nitrogen that you've applied, the analysis of that nitrogen if you've got it, and it will also calculate when that nitrogen will be replaced, will be released by the roots. So that's really important. If you're using an organic approach, you must know when that release occurs, but there are tools to help you do that, both of that CASP program and also this new document.
All right, thank you. So Dr. Brown, we have a question from Joanne. Nitrification took place within 1 to 2 weeks. Do you have an estimated time for volatilization/denitrification to remove an application of nitrogen?
Yeah, that one is very dependent on how you applied. So if you do an unincorporated urea or an unincorporated ammonia on the top of the soil, it could be volatilized almost immediately. If you incorporate those materials into the soil, they will react with the water in the soil and they will stop and the volatilization will not occur. So it's difficult to answer that question. Sometimes fertilizer application, soil surface dry, will be an immediate volatilization and loss if it's a volatile form, urea, for example. Incorporated, much lower. Denitrification is driven by saturated soils, and frequently that will be at depth. And while it can occur quite quickly, that denitrified product will then move back through the drier soil profiles and the process will be reversed. So they are instantaneous processes, there's no question. However, they're controlled by where you have the fertilizer in the system, what type of fertilizer you have in the system, and how deep that nitrogen is in the profile. So a roundabout answer, but we don't typically think of either volatilization or denitrification as large contributors to the nitrogen cycle of an almond orchard. They're small relative to leaching and relative to demand.
All right, thank you. So we have our next questions from Sumit Sharma. At what temperature we should not apply nitrogen?
Well, hi, Sumit. I met him yesterday in the field, so good to see you online. We typically think of, well, firstly, of course, if the trees are not growing, so it's early in the season, you don't have leaves, then that will constrain uptake. That's because it's too cold for the trees and the leaves are not photosynthesizing. That's point number one. If your soils, it's typically thought of below 65 degrees, then the process that converts urea into ammonia and ammonia into nitrate goes very, very slowly. And so you don't get a lot, and I showed you that in that figure previously, you don't get a lot of those nitrification mineralization processes occurring in cold soils. In those circumstances, some growers will favor a nitrate application because nitrate doesn't have to go through those temperature-dependent transformations because there's no microbes involved in nitrate getting into the plant. And so people do that. Challenge is, of course, frequently with cold soils, you will have wet soils and you will have limited transpiration and movement of water into the tree. If you have that circumstance, then you also have the circumstance and the possibility for nitrate to be washed out of the soil because there's all that water around and limited uptake. So if you're going to do an early season nitrate to help give the plants a quick early boost, you need to make sure it is small amounts, timed perfectly with your fertigation so that it's getting into active hungry roots.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Neil Fox. What are the main soil issues you see that may reduce nutrient uptake in almonds? Excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issues we see, high pH soils, compacted soils, those that limit root growth. And quite often you can think of it as anything that limits root growth will limit nutrient exploration. Saturated soils, hard pan soils, high pH soils, poor structure soils where water doesn't move freely. So those are all the things that interact with nutrient uptake. Certainly in the case of zinc, which we talked about before, it was the high pH soils that were the limit and that were the challenge in those soils. So there's a number of things, but basically you have to think about my nitrogen uptake will be compromised if there's anything compromising my root growth.
All right, excellent. Does anyone else have any other questions for Dr. Brown? Sebastian, do you have any comments you would like to make?
No, I think this is great, and we could move to the next section.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. For those who are wanting credit, we have. Oh wait, sorry. I'm sorry. Our next Training Tuesday will be March 16th, and it's the third week coming up. And we'll be talking about techniques and tools to determine when to start irrigating. The CCA credits are currently pending, so just stay tuned and be on the lookout for our In the Orchard events for finding out if the credits have been approved. We hope to see you all there.